international human rights bodies that condemned Nazi Germany for operating the practice of blacklisting. I'd completely forgotten we quoted them all at those.
Does anyone else have anything to share on the screen? No, so just yours. Okay. Shall we begin?
Okay, welcome to this third ICOF event. It's a great pleasure to be chairing, and if I can introduce David Renton, who's a barrister at Garden Court, active in employment law and landlord and tenant, and has recently published Against the Law, Why Justice Requires Fewer Laws and a Smaller State. And Dave Smith is a convener of a blacklist support group supporting trade unionists who've been blacklisted for their political affiliations. And we have Shanice McBean, who is a member of Sisters Uncut, and she has recently, just this week, had a book published with Pluto, which she will tell us more about, and is able to join us online. So, welcome. Yes, do you want to start, David?
Well, that's great, but wait till I said something. I'm going to have just a couple of video clips at the beginning, so perhaps if I just introduce the first of them. Might even stand up to do this. First of all, listen everyone, thank you very much for coming on this, what's been for most of this day, a bitter rain sweat day. But I'm going to start by referring to two short speeches, in each of which a Conservative minister was positioning that party in relation to the rule of law. So we have the Thatcher one first.
It does not succeed. There are those who are using violence and intimidation to impose their will on others who do not want it. I must tell you that what we've got is an attempt to substitute the rule of the mob for the rule of law. And it must not succeed.
So if you think about what was going on in that clip, that's right from the middle of the miners' strike. It's in the direct aftermath of the Battle of Orgreave. And it's got Margaret Thatcher, as it were, trying to create a coalition within Britain for what's obviously a transformative moment. If you think about what's going on, we've got an assault on social democracy, to some extent an assault on democracy itself, from which arguably, certainly British social democracy hasn't particularly recovered even now 40 years later. What she's trying to do, she's trying to use the idea of the rule of law in a particular way, as a cloak beneath which to conceal a transfer of power from those without money or power to those who already had them. So, in a sense, that provides a starting point for what I'm talking about tonight, which is the rule of law. I want to start off with the idea that popular defeat for thousands of causes was the rule of law. Now, I've got a second quote now, which is from a different Conservative minister, which is from 40 years later. It's from this year.
The Secretary of State has said that his committee and the government are committed to the rule of law. Does he recognise that the adherence to the rule of law is not negotiable? Against that background, will he assure us that nothing that is proposed in this legislation does or potentially might breach international legal obligations or international legal arrangements that we have entered into? And can he answer specifically the other point? Was any ministerial direction given?
I would say to my honourable friend that yes, this does break international law in a very specific and limited way. We are taking the power to disapply the EU law concept.
Now, if you think about it, what you're seeing in those two exchanges is a complete transformation in the way in which conservatism presents itself to the people, government presents itself to the people. At one point 40 years ago, at a point of huge social crisis, the thing which was needed to make that social crisis happen, to resolve it on the terms which politicians wanted, was to say the rule of law is sacrosanct. Come forward 40 years later today, and suddenly we've got, well, the rule of law is negotiable. Yes, we're going to break the rule of law, but only in a very specific and limited way. Now, the point I wanted to sort of suggest today is that that notion, that changed relationship to the rule of law, isn't specifically a British phenomenon. It's just the local British expression of something that's happening all around the world. All around the world, centre-right conservative parties have moved themselves from being parties of the rule of law to parties which can quite happily breach the rule of law. And that's true of Bolsonaro, it's true of Netanyahu, it's true of Modi, it's true of Donald Trump, trying to lie and cheat his way out of losing the American election, etc. So the question which I'm just sort of going through everything I'm going to say over the next 10, 15 minutes is basically this. How should people, the left, a critical community, whatever we are, how should we respond to this total change in the way our rulers are talking about the rule of law? Now, one way we could do so is to do so, and I'm going to be slightly unfair here now, slightly parodying a general trend of opinion. But how broadly does the tradition of liberalism, political liberalism, understand this moment? And it seems to me, and again, I'm saying someone who's been at the last two seminars, we've had people who are vocalising, particularly the second of our seminars, who are vocalising this analysis of what was going on. It seems to me that liberalism understands this moment by saying, what the problem is with our present is that rules still exist, but our rulers are no longer willing to be bound by them. So if you want to understand the moment we're in, actually Britain does explain it. Britain explains it in this sense that we provide an absolutely typical example of something that's going on all around the world, and that is how did our rulers, how did our Prime Minister respond to COVID and this huge state of emergency that he was in? And the answer we all remember is basically he said, rules are for small people, rules are for all of you, they're not for me. If I want to travel anywhere, I will travel anywhere. If I want to have a party tonight, I will have a party tonight. So we get this idea that the rulers aren't bound by the rule of law. And it seems to me that the liberal response, and I can't attach this to an individual thinker, but I'm supposing like if you could take a year's worth of editorial comments in The Guardian, summarise them down to their core, what's really being said to explain this moment that we're in, what it tells you about law and what sort of society we should be in, is it seems to me that what liberalism is saying, what it's saying is going on wrong, is that the rules are collapsing. And if the rules are collapsing, inevitably society will collapse. And you can see this, I think, particularly when you think about climate change. I think the argument, in essence, at its core is this. Over the next 10 or 20 years, if we're going to survive as a world, everyone, rich, poor, everyone is going to need to change their behaviour very fast, not just in Britain, but all over the world. For that to happen, our rulers have to set the example. If they're incapable of living by the rules they set for everyone else, then other people won't change their behaviour either. So unless this new world that we've gone into changes really fast, then the future is absolutely disastrous. It's one of social collapse, it's one of barbarism, and it's one of ecocide. If that seems terrible, and I think it does, what I want to emphasise is that liberalism hasn't yet said the catastrophe is inevitable. What it says, it seems to me, is that catastrophe can still be averted, but only if, as the first and most immediate step, is we reassert the primacy of the rule of law. And if you want to see this as something which kind of influences individual politicians and the way they speak and the way they think about what's going on, I think two key exchanges in the last couple of weeks really convey that sense of liberalism, looking at the collapse of the rule of law and thinking, my God, we're all doomed, unless. Think how Keir Starmer presented himself at the first question time after Rishi Sunak had been appointed Prime Minister. And remember how the way he presented himself. The attack lines were all about Suella Braverman, the Home Secretary. Would she uphold the rule of law? But one of the key exchanges when Starmer turns around and says, Rishi Sunak reminds, ideally, the whole of Britain watching, that his previous employment experience was as Director of Public Prosecutions, effectively in some ways the most senior policeman in Britain. What Keir Starmer said, and he's talking about Suella Braverman, he's talking about the Tories, he said, "I know firsthand how important it is that we have a Home Secretary whose integrity and professionalism are beyond question." Or think again of another exchange which Keir Starmer was trying to articulate the kind of liberal resistance to this moment. He said, now he's talking about this week, he's talking about arguments about, in essence, that, you know, was the Labour Party going to be soft? Was the Labour Party going to oppose the Public Order Bill? No, Keir Starmer said, the problem with the Public Order Bill is it was not authoritarian enough. Quote, "What we're pushing for was longer sentences for those who are gluing themselves to roads and motorways, because that's where you're putting lives at risk. We didn't get that through, but that's what I wanted." So you get a liberal critique of conservatism, the new conservatism, by saying, we are more serious about the rules than you are, and we're going to go further in asserting more and tougher rules than you ever would. Now, it's worthwhile thinking, because when the first time you hear this, for a lot of people, and certainly for me, my initial reaction was just to go, oh my God, how evil. Things are bad enough already without the Labour Party saying you'll go further. But there's a logic behind that argument, and it's worth untangling the logic. I think the reason goes something like this. The key task facing the world is to get the oil companies to start obeying all the various international treaties which have been adopted, all of which have as their endpoint the prevention of the world going into environmental disaster by keeping global warming below 1.5 or 2 degrees. The oil companies are ignoring these flatly, and they're building up new capacity, new property rights, and they're sucking oil out of the ground at such a rate that not only are we going to miss 1.5 or 2 degrees, we're going to miss 5 degrees at current rates. So in that situation of crisis, it seems to me the argument goes something like this. We need to reassert those rules, because if we do, if the politicians obey them, if ordinary people obey them, then maybe by some magic, the chief executives of the oil companies will suddenly begin to realise that there's a social bargain which they've not been honouring. They will stop overcharging, they will stop over-extracting. The moment that will make them stop doing those destructive patterns of behaviour is if only they realise that the rules are going to be respected. If so, they'll voluntarily put themselves inside them in a way they haven't been for the last 40 or 50 years. And then nature will heal, and it can and it must. Now, if I'm right, that is the kind of logic of liberalism in relation to the present crisis. One of the things clearly it's lacking, it seems to me, is any sort of realistic sense of how that rescuing of humanity is going to come about. It's got at its centre a utopianism which makes the most wild and ambitious dreams of the old utopian socialists from 30 or 50 or 100 years ago seem absolutely extraordinary. Yes, we can make the oil companies do the things they need to do if we show that we're good and law-abiding people. Somehow this will change their whole attitude towards accumulation of wealth, and so on and so forth. Now, obviously, if that isn't going to deliver the justice we need or the future we need, then in a sense, at least initially, we're in a bleak situation. Conservatism is no longer interested in conserving the world. Liberalism is no longer interested in preserving core liberties. Whoa, what can we all do? And in the time left to me, it seems to me that really all I can do is maybe suggest that the answer might be found, or steps towards the answer might be found, by thinking a bit more deeply about 3 core concepts. And I'll do about 3 or 4 minutes on each of them. Firstly, law. Secondly, again, the rule of law. And thirdly, justice. Firstly, law. Michael very kindly mentioned I've had this book out for a few months. When I wrote it, the big idea I was hoping to restore to public discussion was that the state is something that each of us make. We get to choose how we vote, how we live, the rules we choose to obey, and the ones we choose not to obey, create the laws as they are in the totality. We make them, and we have the freedom to discard some, indeed, you know what, all of them. One of the reasons why the left is in such trouble, it seems to me, is that we still haven't worked out how to deal with a moment when the right is presenting itself as the rule breakers. the temptation is to just respond by saying the opposite of them. No, laws are good, all laws are good, and we'll defend all of them. The problem with that is it drains your ability to conceive of any changes to the law that might be in public or social interests. It becomes impossible to imagine a future. Even the most exciting, intelligent, ambitious politicians, there are some of them in Parliament, even they at their best, find it impossible to imagine an agenda for social reform other than just, well, we'll work through each year of the last bad party's legislative agenda, and bit by bit we will repeal one law, another law, another law, another law, until we've got rid of all of them, and then somehow that's it. People find it impossible to imagine anything more or better than that. But it seems to me that at the very least, it fundamentally misunderstands the law. It treats the law as something mystical, unchangeable. Like the idea, if you're the left, you can't demonstrate against weather. Well, it's true, you can't. If you're the left, you can't demonstrate against maths. It's true. Maths serves a social function and is useful. You would not want to be the people who demonstrate against maths. But the law is not like maths. The law is not like the weather. The law is actually something human beings can create and change. And that we can turn around and say, for example, if you're serious about justice, what were the key legal instruments which are at the core of the Thatcherite settlement? Anti-union laws, the right to buy, other laws which created a private market in the rental sector. You'd say the asylum system, you'd say prevent. You can actually abolish and remove every single one of those laws. Even if politicians in Parliament seem to think that would be impossible and unachievable, actually you can, you could, we must. That's the law. Now on the rule of law. Again, thinking back to some of the earlier sessions we've had in this seminar series, there was, I thought, a key exchange in the first seminar series when we had Conor Gearty, we had Paul MacDonald, and Paul O'Connell, and they were talking about what actually is the rule of law. And one of the points they made, it comes from E.P. Thompson's famous book, Whigs and Hunters, is he says the rule of law isn't just a fiction that exists to kind of conceal the domination of society by the rich. It's also, to some extent, a shield in favour of the poor. To play that role, people have to believe in it, and they will only believe in it if, on some occasion, poor people can win victories through that. If the law never serves that purpose, people stop believing in the law and it becomes useless and it falls apart. So to retain that position, it has to offer people in their day-to-day lives enough real experience of fairness so that they continue to believe in it. It may be from one perspective, all we're being offered is breadcrumbs, but the sheer fact that we are being offered breadcrumbs means there must be some bread. Now, I accept those arguments. I think there's a lot of wisdom to them. My point only is that it also seems to me that lots more is going on than just that. The rule of law is Margaret Thatcher during the miners' strike. The rule of law is the idea that some of the worst culprits we've had as politicians will be challenged. Boris Johnson is no longer Prime Minister, but he got to govern before we got to bring him low. And in relation to the vast majority of their side's corruption, most of the time, most people are without protection. The rule of law is both the moments of tyrant shaming and the long periods in which refugees are being held in conditions akin to concentration camps. It is both. We need to grasp its dual character, the two-sidedness of it. And then the third thing, coming towards the end now, the third thing to mention is justice. We've had law, we've had the rule of law. But the other concept we need to have is a sort of a society capable of just transformation to a non-carboniferous future. A world in which the oil executives will be brought low, just as in the previous generation Mussolini was brought low. The existence of the rule of law, I accept, implies the possibility of this future, but not law. Not the laws we have governing our workplaces, not the laws we have which protect spy cops, not the laws whose product is the humdrum, arbitrary policing that the best campaigners of our day are now calling to abolish. So the moment you start thinking about that more generous society and the complete social transformation you'd need to get there, you're talking, I'd argue, if you want to summarise what I'm saying in a few words, it's this. You're talking of a process which can only happen outside and to some extent against the law. Leave it there.
Thank you very much indeed. Dave.
I'll also stand up. I I might have to put my glasses on so I can actually see what I've written. First of all, thank you very much for SOAS for inviting me, and for Dave for inviting me. My name's Dave Smith. I'm a building worker by trade. I'm working class. I come from East London, part of East London called Dagenham, which some of you may have heard of and some of you may not have. And when I left school, I became a trade unionist. And it's great to speak at SOAS because I can talk about something a bit more philosophical than I normally get to asked to speak about. David asked us to. Tonight's thing's called what's it called? Police abolition, law abolition. So I thought, well, okay, let's run with this one then. So, when I was growing up in school, they teach you stuff in school. It's sort of fed into you as you're growing up. The rule of law, democracy, trust the police, all of that kind of stuff. And so when I've been a trade unionist, I've been dismissed from work for being a trade union member. It's against the law to dismiss someone because you're a trade unionist. I've been dismissed multiple times. And I've been to employment tribunals multiple times, and the judge writing up about it says, oh yes, they've definitely dismissed you because you're a trade union activist. I've lost every time in court. It's against the law to blacklist people for being a member of a trade union. Yet in this country, about 15 years ago, they found an illegal blacklist that all of the big multinational companies in this country were using. All the household names, so Robert McAlpine, Carillion, Balfour Beatty, they built all of the Olympic stadiums. They're that big, that huge, these people. And my name was on that list. It's against the law. David Renton was my barrister. And we took the case all the way to the European Court of Human Rights. And at every single stage of the case, the written judgment from the judge was, you've terrible injustice, your human rights have been breached. Every single step, all the way to the European Court of Human Rights, we lost. Every single time. So this idea that the law is there to bring us justice and sort of everyone is equal before the law just doesn't fit with the reality that me and lots of other trade unionists and working people have found. And it even starts from, it's not just about my personal case, it's the employment law in Britain is based on this fundamental thing, which is the contract of employment. This is the logic that the law has, and everything in British employment law flows from this logic. And it says a contract of employment is a legally enforceable agreement between two free and equal parties. Now, the notion that there's two parties, me as the worker and them as the company, okay, I get that. Free, the idea is meant to be, well, no one's forcing you to work for them. You're free to not work for them if you don't want to, and no one's forcing the employer to employ you. But the idea that we're equal is just complete and it's a fantasy, It's, me negotiating with a multinational company about what my terms and conditions can be. It's just complete fairy tale. Yet it's the absolute basis of all British employment law. And then within that, it has this, the contradiction is huge. In order to demonstrate that you've got a contract, one of the things you have to demonstrate is there's a test which is called the master and servant test, which literally says that they're the master and I'm the servant. So the idea that there's two free and equal parties, there's even a contradiction within itself, but it's absolutely essential for any contract of employment to work. And so far from employment law being there to help working people be exploited by big business, what employment law actually does is legitimises that imbalance between working people and big corporations. And the blacklisting case that David did went to the European Court of Human Rights, but we also had a trial at the High Court. It was a case action, group action one, and we had like 700 or 800 claimants. I was one of the claimants in the High Court. And the biggest multinationals in Britain were in court. We've got all the evidence. We know who did it. We've got we know the names of the directors who were literally orchestrating this illegal blacklist. And they bought themselves out of a trial. If you pay enough money and you're rich, you can literally buy yourself out of a trial. And that's what they did. So even though we know what they've done, even though everywhere we've got this sort of saccharine apology from their lawyer in court. Not one of them has had to stand up and be accountable, and they can literally go to a public tender anywhere in the world and say, we've had no convictions against us about this. So in America, if you get a conviction against blacklisting, you can't go for a public tender in American public sector. But because they've forked out a few quid, it's not a court of law, justice, it's a court of law. And the law allows the rich to buy themselves out of trial and buy themselves out of convictions. But if you protest against it, if you protest against the blacklist, then you can be arrested for standing in a road. So the directors of multinational companies who stopped me working for years on end and made me unemployed, made me nearly lose my house, and my kids being on free school meals and that kind of stuff, they get away scot-free, yet because I stood in a road, I've got a criminal conviction against me, which if my employer does a DBS check against me, means I can't do certain jobs. Once again, the inequality is absolutely glaring. And once again, what I think we've got is, although we get taught this in law, oh yes, the law applies exactly the same to everybody, it's an illusion. It's an absolute illusion that it applies the same to everybody. There's a great quote from a bloke that I like. His name's Anatole France. And his quote is, "The law in its infinite wisdom forbids the rich and the poor to sleep underneath bridges or beg in the streets or steal loaves of bread." And isn't there a great, can there be a better summing up of the reality of it? Because it's never going to be applied to the rich. It looks like these laws are applied to everybody, but in reality, they will only ever be applied to certain people. And I think if we're going to talk about the rule of law, then what we need to do is talk about context and see the law. The law doesn't sit in itself in some kind of bubble in outer space. It's part of the society we live in. And, so anyone who's a student at SOAS or anyone who's involved in social activism or social history in any sense of the word would say, okay, let's look back through history. The law in Rome, ancient Rome allowed slavery. The law in Nazi Germany with Adolf Hitler allowed, literally Jewish people to be rounded up and sent to concentration camps. The law in South Africa allowed black people to be discriminated against compared to white people because of apartheid. The law in the deep south of America allowed segregation because all of them things were legal. Absolutely every single one of those things were legal. And any student at SOAS, and not only students at SOAS, dogs in the street know that those laws are not there to protect everybody, they're there to protect the ruling elite. They're there to protect the people who are in charge. And anybody would recognise that looking back through any kind of historical pacing. And it's not just the law, it's the state apparatus. It's the judiciary. It's the legal system, it's the police, it's the army, it's the security services. In all of those, different types of society that I've talked about, that are part and parcel of enforcing that, question of, the law being there to protect the ruling elite. Because it's all about power. Everyone seems to be able to recognise that when it's a long way away or it's back in history. But almost when it comes to the UK in 2022, it's almost like blinkers. It's almost like, oh my God, yeah, well that was true back then, but of course in Britain in 2022, it's one person, one vote, and it's parliamentary democracy, it's a Western liberal democracy. Adolf Hitler was elected to power. He won the election and went to power in Germany. But what we have to do in Britain today, if we're looking at the rule of law, is place it in context of Western liberal democracy. Because what the context is capitalism. Sorry to use the C word, but that's what the context is. We're in a situation where, yes, you get one person, one vote, but where does the power lie? As I said, I grew up in Dagenham, in East London. The biggest employer in Dagenham was Ford Motor Company. And Dagenham, in reality, is one massive council estate that was built originally to house the people who worked in Ford Motor Company. And when I was growing up, every single councillor on the council was a Labour councillor. They had 2 MPs, Barking and Dagenham Council, Barking constituency, Dagenham constituency. Both of them were Labour MPs since the day that it was set up as a constituency. And in the early 2000s, they had a Labour government as well. It was the Blair government in charge. And the biggest thing that could ever happen to London Borough, Barking and Dagenham was they closed Fords. They shut down Fords, and it decimated an area that was already poor, and whole swathes of mass unemployment. The love of small industries and companies going into it were all devastated, and it didn't matter which way we voted, because the people who had the power wasn't the elected politicians. The people who had the power were the people who sit on the boards of directors of a multinational company that doesn't even exist in this country. It's over in America. We're making that decision that decimated the lives of, thousands of people. And we live in, if we talk about context, because we all do about slavery in ancient Rome and, fascist Italy and all the rest of it, we live in a situation where the global political economy is absolutely entirely devised around the fact of big business and corporations making profit, of private corporations making money and going forward. And it's been instilled in our brain to such an extent that sometimes we can't even, as I said, can't even fathom that it could ever be any other way. The idea of a limited liability company was only introduced in law in 1855, about 150 years ago. For all of human history prior to that, there was no such thing as a limited liability company. And when you have a situation where the profits of big business is more important than the human rights of workers, you end up with, when the British government wanted to ban asbestos in this country, it couldn't. Because the biggest exporter of asbestos in the world was Canada, and they took the British and the French government to the World Trade Organization, proclaiming it would be a breach of free trade to have this. I mean, it's, the absurdity of this, that anything to do that interrupts profit is, sort of trumps human rights, or, as David said, the global, the globe, because of climate change and all the rest of it. Where it leads to a situation where billionaires have got their own private spaceships, and yet we've got millions of people in the world starving to death. Where we've got people who can't afford to pay their bills, their energy bills, their food bills, and. The blacklisting thing, once again, I'm the secretary of the Blacklist Support Group, so I make no apologies for talking about it again. The rights of the multinational companies trumped the rights of thousands of construction workers. As I said, we know who these people are. And the question that we ask is, this was an illegal blacklist. It was against the law, this blacklist. They actually, since we set up the campaign, they changed the law and introduced a new piece of law, the Blacklisting Regs 2010. And so you'd think, well, what were the police doing during all this time? What were the police doing? And I'll tell you what the police were doing. They were giving PowerPoint presentations to the illegal blacklist. They literally turned up. Detective Chief Inspector Gordon Mills from one of these shady police bodies called the National Extremism Tactical Coordination Unit literally turned up to a secret meeting of an illegal blacklist and gave a PowerPoint presentation about how to stop, people like me getting jobs on their building sites. So how does this possibly happen? It possibly happens because going back to the question of the state and the police, the people who are in charge of the higher echelons of the British state, whether it's whether it's the judges, whether it's the media, whether it's the police or the security services, they've got a certain mindset. You don't get to that position unless you've got a certain mindset, and that mindset is colonialism. They have had hundreds of years of get to work out how they're going to rule the world, how they're going to oppress people to make it look as if it's nice and democratic, but in reality stamp down on dissent. And there's a big discussion nowadays about whether we should defund the police, the Metropolitan Police, whether the Metropolitan Police should be disbanded. And I'm a Londoner, And I tell you now, Londoners hate the Metropolitan Police, absolutely hate it. You know, it's not something new. You know, yes, there's Sarah Everard, yes, there's Black Lives Matter, yes, there's other stuff, but you know, there was Grumwick, where the police absolutely battered people. There was Wapping, where the police absolutely battered people. You know, we can go back to Stephen Lawrence, Ricky Rill murders when I was growing up, and we all know, you know, all these reports that are coming out are telling us that the police are terribly racist and terribly misogynistic. Literally, tell us something that any Londoner doesn't know. You know, this is just, you know, of course they are, and we all know it. And people say, oh yes, but what about the other things that the police do? What about the stuff that when there's domestic violence, they go in and help domestic? What about when there's parking tickets? What about when there's stuff to do with, I don't know, you know, crime prevention in schools or something like that? All of them things need doing. But I tell you who could do them, the council. We could have the council doing crime prevention in school. We could have the Department of Transport doing parking and speeding offences and motoring offences and that kind of stuff. We could have social services being given more authority to be able to do domestic violence stuff. But the reason they don't do it is because the police plays more than just that role. By having these thousands of police officers involved in stuff like that, every police officer has to do public order training. Every single one of them, irrespective of what they do, even if they sit behind a desk all day, they all have to do public order training. And what you have got is this reserve army of thousands of people up and down the country, when if there is ever a mass mobilisation of working people against the way society lives, thousands of people who have been trained in how to hold back thousands of people. That's what the police is. It's the armed bodies of men and women that is there to protect to protect the ruling class. And of course, you know, in 2022, the police is not purely just state oppression, but there's an academic in America from the University of Washington. I'm trying to look at the name. Otwin Merinin, and the famous quote is, "The role of the police today is parking tickets and class oppression." So you know, they do both. But you can't, they don't just do the parking ticket side of it. The class oppression side of it is absolutely central to what they do. I've probably spoken for too long, so I'll wrap up, and I've got some other bits and pieces that I can do when we do Q&A. But what I do want to close on is this idea that, you know, the notion or the idea that what goes on in Parliament is democracy. That's nonsense. Democracy is much bigger than what goes on in Parliament. And if you're in a capitalist society where all of the media is controlled by billionaires, Rupert Murdoch doesn't even get a vote in this country. But no one's telling me Rupert Murdoch's got more influence than one person, one vote. He clearly has on British democracy and the way society works. So if we're interested in the rule of law, if we're interested in justice, if you're interested in democracy, then we need to look beyond Parliament. You know, was abolish the law, abolish the police, abolish Parliament to extend democracy to where it really should be. Progress comes from mass mobilisations, not relying on lawyers and not relying on politicians. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that passionate and heartfelt contribution. I'm not quite sure how I call Shanice in now. Can you do that?
I think she can hear us.
Yeah.
Thank you. Shanice, welcome.
Hiya. So I wanted to argue today that the idea of the rule of law is a new terrain of class struggle. Not necessarily new, actually, but is an increasingly important factor to consider in struggle today, and in particular in struggle against catastrophe, both in this country and also globally. And to, I guess, introduce that kind of idea and that argument, I want to go back to the 13th of March, 2021. And for those of you who may not remember, or that date might not be familiar, It was the Clapham Common vigil that took place days after we found out that Sarah Everard was murdered by a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And I think the reason why that date and that event and that moment was so pivotal is because of the kind of context around that vigil. So the first thing to note is that that vigil on the 13th of March had been banned by the police, and there had been a series of court proceedings that were being led on by a group called Reclaim These Streets, and that those court proceedings ended in the maintenance of the ban. So all the courts kind of said, you know, it's not our business to get involved in this, and the Metropolitan Police were able to use COVID-19 legislations to ban that vigil. And we actually later found out after the fact, after the vigil took place, that it had been Priti Patel, the Home Secretary at the time, who had intervened in the decision-making on a local level in Lewisham, and had intervened and got Scotland Yard to intervene in that local policing operation, which at the beginning was supposed to allow the vigil to take place, but then Scotland Yard intervened and it was banned. And what was significant about that moment was several things, which is, first of all, the expectation I think that a lot of people had about the behaviour of police that day didn't actually match the reality of what took place. And what took place was violence and brutality. And, you know, even I was quite surprised that that's the strategy that they took, given the context of Sarah Everard, who had been, you know, we only recently found out at that point had been murdered, and not just murdered by any man, but a serving Metropolitan Police officer. And I think our expectation going into that banned vigil was that there would be some sense of the optics of, you know, violently cracking down on a majority protest, a majority vigil of women who were there to mourn the murder of another woman. But I think the reality actually drew out an important contradiction. And the reality was, you know, police brutality on that day. Women were pinned down to the ground by police officers, violently arrested. You know, there were things that were thrown at protesters. There was, you know, pulling and dragging people off of the bandstand. Horrific levels of police brutality took place that day against a crowd that was majority women. And I think that drew out the contradiction that exists, particularly around the police, but around institutions that enforce the law more generally, of the expectation of protection versus the reality of social control and social coercion. And I think the lesson from that moment was that taking moments where we can defy the law, undermine the legitimacy of the law, turn up to the banned protest, protest in a way that is legislated against. What those moments enable us to do is it forces the state to make decisions. Are we going to allow these protesters to kind of, you know, contravene the law? Are we going to allow them to kind of do their own thing, in which case, you know, we demonstrate our own weakness? Or are we going to crack down on their fundamental human rights? Are we going to crack down on the right to protest, on the right to assemble in day-to-day life, in which case we demonstrate our authoritarianism and our brutality? And I think that really was an important lesson in terms of delegitimizing laws that are bad for us, and the importance of doing that. And I think that is where, so the Kill the Bill movement then came out of that Clapham Common vigil. And I think that movement made an important intervention in the conversation about, well, what do we do about laws that just don't work for us, and legislation that causes ordinary and working class and marginalized people harm? And I think one of the debates and discussions of that movement was the idea of becoming ungovernable. And I think that's a really important lesson for us moving forward as the authoritarianism of the government and of the ruling class intensifies. And that idea of ungovernability, so where that came from was there was a debate in the Kill the Bill movement about, well, how do we take this movement forwards? Do we take that fight to the streets where we mobilize? where we, challenge state power and state control and coercion on the streets? Or do we take the fight against police, encroaching police powers and intensifying police powers? Do we take that fight through Parliament, trying to lobby and influence members of Parliament and politicians to kind of vote against the incoming police powers of the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill? And I think the argument that some of us were making at that time was that, look, we've got a ruling class in crisis, we've got a government in crisis, which then creates a tendency for them towards authoritarianism, towards more fascistic ways of controlling, as Dave said, dissent. And I think, it's no wonder that it's the context of the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement and, new burgeoning and exciting tactics in the environmentalist movement that we're then getting things like the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act and the Public Order Bill as a direct response to our determination to fight back. And I think of note is the fact that, the Black Lives Matter protests of 2020 were the biggest anti-racist protests that this country has seen since the movement to abolish slavery. So, sometimes we can be quite negative about where we are on the left and as a movement. And I think it's important to be critical, but we're also at a time where struggle, has been on the rise. Social movements have been fighting back and growing. And I think it's no surprise then that the state has been responding, on the one hand, ideologically with the culture wars, but on the other hand, legislatively, and using the kind of coercive arms of the state, be that policing or even be that institutions like schools and hospitals, to control and batten down on people. And so the idea of ungovernability is a response to that. And what it says is that these laws don't work for us. These laws are unethical. The law and legislation is not this kind of mystical creature that exists and is, completely unfathomable and can't be touched. Actually, we have a duty, we have a moral duty to fight back, to ignore, to defy laws that cause us, ordinary people, harm. And I think there have been some, really, really great moments and where activist groups and organisers have kind of taken up the mantle of that idea of ungovernability. And a couple of moments that I wanted to point out were in March this year, when Sisters Uncut let off 1,000 rape alarms outside Charing Cross Station. And that was a deliberate attempt to say, well, if you're going to make noisy protest illegal, then we are going to give you the noisiest protests. And I think another example of that is actually the Don't Pay campaign. If you are going to force us into poverty with these crippling, energy bills, we're just not going to pay. Another example is Sharon Graham, making the point that if future Conservative leaders make trade union organising unlawful, then I'm afraid we're just going to have to take unlawful work action in our workplaces. And then finally, the actions of Just Stop Oil. And I know there have been debates about, the usefulness of certain tactics, but let's take it back down to this notion of ungovernability. And I think, defying injunctions, defying, the Public Order Act, it's an important tool and tactic that I think we need to take elsewhere. And I think one of the things that it's incumbent upon social movements to do as we move more and more into authoritarianism, closer and closer towards barbarism, is escalating our tactics of ungovernability, not demobilizing them, and taking as many opportunities as we can to defy laws that cause us harm, legislation that doesn't work for ordinary people. And connected to this is the idea of withdrawing consent to policing as a strategy to undermine, or as a tactic rather, to undermine police power in this country. And to understand what I guess that might mean in a practical way, what does it mean to withdraw your consent? I think becoming ungovernable and defying the law is in itself an example of withdrawing your consent to, this mythical idea of this untouchable law. But specifically with regards to the police, I think it has really important implications for our work. So to kind of introduce the idea, I think it's important to go back to when the Metropolitan Police was founded, which was in 1829. And, you know, there's often this idea of Victorian crime waves, and you know, the Metropolitan Police were founded as this ethical institution to protect the ordinary person. And the reality couldn't be further from that mythology. And actually, you know, to summarize what was quite a tumultuous few decades in the early 1800s, the general context was the industrial working class were on the move. Strikes, mass demonstrations, and then when they tried to ban strikes, sabotage, direct action, all sorts of action was taking place from a working class that was almost, in a way, new to its power. You know, the industrial working class at that time was quite fresh. You know, land enclosures weren't that long ago, and you know, factories were quite new and fresh, and the bourgeoisie, the ruling class, was a burgeoning class as opposed to an established class at that time. And in fact, in 1829, the Metropolitan Police were formed within the context of increasing strike waves across the country. They were responding to the need to protect the interests of the burgeoning bourgeois class and the state. And I think, but what was key about that moment was and the reason why it was a state-funded force that was necessary and not, say, the army, was because, well, they tried lethal violence, and, you know, lethal violence and using the cavalry to kill people worked really well in the colonies, where you had a disposable army of black and brown labor that you could just kill off and replace, and kill off and ship in more slaves or ship in more laborers from elsewhere. But that material reality didn't exist in the same way in the mainland. And when they did lean on lethal violence, for example, the 1819 Peterloo massacre, as opposed to quelling that mass demonstration, it actually made that mass demonstration bigger, more vibrant, more boisterous, and more radical. And so as the industrial working class was, you know, coming into its own power, a new form of social control, a new form of social and class coercion was needed to protect the interests of the ruling class. And this is where you get the idea of policing by consent, as opposed to immediately leaning on lethal violence. And I just want to bracket that with the fact that some communities do still experience lethal violence. And, you know, your black people are more likely to be killed by the police. We're 4 times more likely to have lethal force used against us. So I'm not saying lethal violence is never used, but the idea of policing by consent came from the need to have consent within the majority population, within the, you know, the British mainland, to the new police powers that were needed to kind of protect the interests of the ruling class. And so mechanisms of consent that you get are the idea that, for example, you know, police are just civilians with more power. They just you and I, they you know, they come from our communities, and they come from, you know, they come from a family just like yours. And also, you know, mechanisms of policing by consent include things such as, you know, the idea that everyone is equal under the law and everyone should be policed equally, etc. This idea of kind of like a benevolent police power. And I think in the modern day, there are really quite clear ways in which this idea of consent to policing is kind of weeded into our psyches and weeded into our everyday, you know, world. I think of the fact that, for example, every time there is a major police incident, whether that was Stephen Lawrence, whether that was Sarah Everard, we get a new report into policing. And, you know, in hindsight, we now have the ability to look back on several major reports, Scarman, McPherson, that have taken place in the past. And at the time, you know, we see these as quite huge victories, getting a vindication of the racism or of the kind of, you know, malpractice within policing. But actually, in reality, what those moments have ended up doing is giving consent to the idea of policing, but we just need to police in a different way. And so what you get is a situation where policing power remains in place, it just looks different. And that's the exact same that that we get from recruitment drives in police forces as well. We're going to keep police powers exactly the same, but the person administering those powers, the person using force, the person, pressing the trigger on the taser or the gun is black or gay or trans or a woman. And all these mechanisms do is provides a new way for a different generation to legitimize the power of police, whilst the power of policing remains as violent as ever. And so, following the McPherson report, again, the benefit of hindsight, policing hasn't got better. In fact, disproportionality in stop and search has got worse. If you look at the first three months of COVID, for example, the number of black men and boys in London stopped and searched in the first 3 months of the pandemic was a number equivalent to 25% of London's entire black male population. That's a horrific, and that was at a time when crime was on a decrease. That's a horrific level of, state harassment and violence. And so far from these, we've had even just yesterday, a report into misogyny in policing. And the idea to quell the response to that will no doubt be, to change the recruitment processes. But again, all this does is change the people enforcing the same violence. And so the idea of withdrawing our consent to policing is looking at these mechanisms that justify police power and saying no to them. We don't care about the recruitment process in the police. We don't care about what reports you do. We say no to the idea of police power, period. And that is in its own way an argument for kind of abolishing the police. And I guess the final thing I'll say is, and touching on something that Dave Smith mentioned, was okay, well, if we're going to abolish all this stuff, whether it's, ignoring laws that harm us or getting rid of institutions such as the police that cause harm and, administer violence in society, well, what do we replace them with? And I think it's important to note that consent to policing isn't just ideological. It isn't just, we create this idea of a benevolent police service that people believe in, and that's where the consent comes from. Policing also responds to something material, particularly in working class life. Working class people increasingly now in cost of living crisis have very little, crumbs, escalating rents, the inability to buy a home, inability to pay your bills, people starving, child poverty increasing. And so that creates a material reality where people want to hold on to the very little that they already have. And the thing that we look to help protect, the very little, the few crumbs that we have, are institutions like the police, are punitive institutions. And unfortunately, they don't actually work. But actually trade union struggles, workplace struggles to, put resources back into communities, money back into people's pockets. These are vital. This is a vital element to the struggle against policing and the struggle to withdraw consent from policing, because it's about undermining and delegitimizing the needs that working class people feel they have for this kind of punitive state power. And I think, just to end, I'll point towards the public health approach that Glasgow, for example, took to knife crime. And I want to use knife crime because obviously I live in London and people listening to this will be living in London as well. And obviously, we don't want people to die on our streets. We don't want people to get, harmed by violence and by knives. And I think it's important to say that the project to abolish stuff isn't just the project to get rid of, it's a project to rebuild. And a good example of this is the public health approach that Glasgow took to knife crime, whereby, as opposed to leaning on the criminal justice system as a first port of call, they offered people who are at risk of getting involved in street knife-based violence routes out of that violence in the form of education, employment opportunities, training opportunities, mental health support. There were resources put into intervention in families around domestic violence, because we know that there is a strong connection between violence in the home and violence on the streets. And they saw a tangible, statistically significant reduction in knife crime over a period of time. And so we know that there are social responses to harm in society. And we also know that the police don't successfully respond to them. In fact, they're crap at it. Around 98% of rapes that are reported to the police don't end in charge. People often ask, well, what will you do with the rapists and murderers? Well, I'm afraid we already live in a society where rape is decriminalised, where there is no accountability for sexual violence. The police are solving, or in fact, the police are charging the lowest level of crimes in their history. At 6% of reported crimes end in charge. Now, if I took paracetamol and 94% of the time I died, we'd probably say, you know, there's something wrong with this paracetamol thing. Maybe no, people shouldn't take paracetamol anymore. So why is it the case that police can be so crap at their own stated aim and we still continue to believe in the mythology of that institution? So that in itself is an argument for getting rid and rebuilding in the interests of ordinary working class people.
Thank you very much for all those really thought-provoking contributions. There's so much I would like to ask, but this is your meeting, so I'm wondering if we can take anyone from the floor who would like both to make a contribution and ask questions, please. Yes, please.
Firstly, thank you very much. Very informative and thoroughly enjoyable. I can speak to. To all of you, the rule of law is being systematically eroded. I think we've almost worked that out. On a worldwide basis, isn't that just a natural progression of the commercialisation of the legal system itself? Isn't that what happens when you commercialise it? It will become eroded. To David and Shanice, undermining the legitimacy of the law, isn't that the same thing that corporations and companies do with big money inside of our courtrooms? And finally, isn't the solution that everyone has to become shareholders in the law, in the legal system? Isn't that the only way to resolve this? Where people can actually have access to justice? They're my questions.
Could you say a little bit more about how people would become shareholders in the system?
Well, firstly, they've got to believe in the system. The system must function. Where you've got the profession of law, and for whatever reason, are charging copious amounts of money, that's going to sway access to justice.
Thank you. Would you like to take those? And maybe, Shanice, would you like to respond first? And we'll go in reverse order for that.
Would it be worth taking more than one, though? Because if all three of us respond on every question, we'll probably only have time for 2 or 3 questions. Whereas if we take 2 or 3 as a group, then...
How many people would like to ask questions? I would ordinarily do that, but I think with this audience, maybe we do it this way. I think you're normally right, but could we have a response to that? And then...
Yeah, do you want me to start?
Yes, please. Thank you.
So I guess I would contest the idea that the system is not functioning. I actually think the system is functioning very well. The question is, who is the system functioning for and in whose interests? And I think I didn't actually circle back around to my original point, which is the rule of law as a terrain for class struggle. And I think actually what we need to think about in terms of who has power to use the law and who can use the law to influence their own interests, that's where the struggle lies, I think. You know, I don't think it's ever been the case that the law has been neutral. And in fact, who the law works for is a question of, well, who holds power? And I think that's where I think we need to take back that power. I think that is actually where I would identify as an activist, as an ordinary person, you know, not a lawyer, the struggle, the terrain of struggle being. You know, it's not necessarily a case of trying to, and I don't think it's possible to build a legal system that is completely neutral. If you also live in a society that is hierarchically determined on the basis of power and exploitation and oppression, and it's going to be the people who have power to exploit and oppress and marginalize who will be able to use the law in their favor. And so I think there was, you know, the question is the system functioning? Yes, it's working very well for some people, and I think it's about rebalancing that book and making it work well for us, as opposed to having this idea that the law can somehow be neutral, which I don't think it can be.
Thank you.
I pretty much agree with Shanice, to be honest. The idea that I hear this a lot actually, that if we had better access to the law, if it was cheaper to get into, and if we had better laws, that therefore the ills of society would be improved, kind of stuff. And I just don't believe it, because as I said, my experience is employment law primarily, but there's been laws against racial discrimination in the workplace since the 1970s. Does that mean no one's discriminated against in the workplace? Of course they are, every day of the week. There's been laws against unfair dismissal for 40 odd years, 50 years. Does that mean there's no unfair dismissal? Of course there are. It happens all the time, non-stop. It's not the thing that the people I talk to, because they know I'm a union activist, say to it is, can my employer do this? Can my employer do that? And the truth is, the employer can do anything they get away with. Because if they do it and no one challenges them, then they've got away with it. They've done it. And the idea of that the way we're going to improve things is to hand over what is a fight between the employer and a group of workers. We should hand that over to lawyers, even if there's better access, even if they're better lawyers, if there's better law, to give it to them to fight our fights for us. I think completely misses, as I said, the dynamics and the class relation, the power relationships in the workplace and into society. Look, health and safety law says that the employer has got a duty of care to look after your health, safety and welfare and shouldn't put your life at risk. And there's when they were building Wembley Stadium, the new Wembley Stadium a few years ago, it was a heat wave. And workers working inside Wembley Stadium were literally fainting with the heat inside Wembley Stadium. And they called in the health and safety executive, and the workers were asking for shade to be put up down on the ground pitch level of Wembley Stadium, and for additional water points to be put all around the stadium for workers when they're overheating to come in and shade and drink. And the inspector for, and I know this because I've done joint events with him, the chief inspector for the health and safety executive for construction in London said to them, there is no law requiring the employer to put these extra water points in. There is no law requiring the employer to put these extra shade areas in. So the employer is not breaking the law. And so what the workers did is, after the health and safety inspector left the site, is it all of the workers on site collectively, someone went round shouting in people's ears about it, said, come on, the law ain't going to help us, we've got to do it ourselves. And what they all did is they all went and sat in the canteen and just literally said, we're not coming out to work until you install this extra shade and all this extra. It's a tiny little thing, but literally within an hour or so, they'd brought in all these water things and they'd brought these additional shade things. And that's a tiny little thing about, health and safety in a workplace. But what it demonstrates is, even if the law was better, even if there's better access to the law, what we're going to do? Take them to court about it, No, but workers coming together collectively, even if we have to break the law in order to get the employers to do it, that's the way that we get things. And I really think Shanice's point about having this discussion, the discussion at the moment that is taking place within the trade union movement, but also the wider social justice movements, whether it be Black Lives Matter or the environmental movement or whatever, is, should we be arguing for the repeal of these laws, or should we be defying the laws? Because if we argue for the repeal of the laws, effectively all of our eggs are in the basket of, let's get a new government elected that isn't the Tories. And what if we do all of that stuff and they still don't repeal it? what if we do all that stuff and we don't win the election? Or should we defy the laws? Because where there's been real progress ever in society is where people come together and defy the laws. Apartheid wasn't defeated by changing the law, it was defeated by the African National Congress. Women didn't get the vote in this country by the law changing. Women got the law because the suffragettes literally had this mass movement of civil disobedience. And the trade union movement had a slogan many, many years ago, and I think we should remember it now. And the slogan was, it's better to break the law than it is to break the poor. And I think we should go back to that one again. Once again, sorry, that was a rant again, but I'm just...
if I can put it a bit differently, I'm not obviously I agree with how Dave and Shanice have posed it, but I do think that if you think about your question about commercialisation, to my mind, it kind of forces to add an extra layer to the argument, if you don't mind. And obviously, like the whole theme of today's event is we need to abolish the law, we need to break the police, we need to break the law too. But I think you also do need, in the present climate, to have one other layer to the argument as well, which is that actually we need to be cognizant that on the other side of the argument, they're trying to abolish the law too. They're trying to break the laws too. And so therefore it's not quite solely as simple as just we must break and abolish law, but it's also, we've got to do it on our terms and in our ways. And if we don't, there's a problem. Now, to try and put that a bit more concrete, the argument you're putting, which is the problem with the law is it's commercialised, is a very vulnerable and old argument in Britain. You know, when Shakespeare wrote a play about the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, what did he have the characters do when they stormed London? He has them all say, now let's go and hang all the lawyers. But 1381 is quite a long time ago. You could find people in the 16th century, you could find people in the 18th century, you could find people in the early 19th century who said the problem with the law is it's too expensive. But I think you kind of need to have a bit of a sense that actually at various times there have been serious reform projects that were precisely intended to stop that happening any further. And they emerge in the same period. And you think, we all know this from democracy, yeah? If you go back to the early 1800s, you had old corruption and the rich people bought the MPs. And you had these dodgy constituencies where just an aristocrat paid for who was going to be the MP. And then afterwards you had an election to confirm their vote. In the same way that the working class came up with strategies to try and make democracy meaningful, you know, paid MPs, annual parliaments and so on, which try and stop MPs being corrupted. There was a similar argument in terms of the law, and it produced certain gains. And those gains include, for example, in the criminal sector, legal aid, and in the civil sector too, legal aid, although it works slightly differently. Now, or you could talk about employment. Again, I'm really an advocate of abolishing the employment tribunal, but it does make a difference that we have a tribunal system where at present trade unions can send people to them, even if, you know, at times that's been really hard, for example, during fees. So it's about abolition, but it's about abolition on our own terms. And what's happening right now, and I'd say this is someone who, you know, Dave very kindly said earlier that I represented in court 4 times and we lost every time. This is true, but I promise you it's not my day-to-day experience as a lawyer. My actual day-to-day experience representing people in employment and housing is actually, I'd say, 2/3, 3/4 of the time I win. And there's certain reforms which were made to the law which made it possible to represent poor people and people without property in the law. And just one of them I'll talk about for a few sentences is legal aid, and particularly civil legal aid. Civil legal aid means that when I get up and defend people in housing, I can run arguments of extreme complexity, and invariably, put it crudely, there is a better legal type team on the side of the poor people than there is on the side of the people who represent the housing, the local councils, the housing authorities, even the private owners of buildings. At a certain level, they've got more money than this, but it takes a long time to do it. And we have people protected against costs. If we win, they have to pay all our costs at commercial rate, and if we lose, someone in legal aid has to pay nothing. So there were certain shields which were put in place. One of the big problems is that those shields are all being taken away, and some of them, for example, legal aid, civil legal aid, has been taken away incredibly fast. Since 2013, half of all civil of law centres in Britain have closed, over half. And I can go into it. All I'm just saying is making the point that there's actually been a lot of wisdom intelligence designed to solve the exact problem you raised, commercialisation, reverse it, and in certain ways in the middle years of the 20th century, actually for quite a long time we did, and now it's been taken away. Now, it being taken away remakes all the arguments which Shanice and Dave have been making about why we need to have legal abolition. But I think, to me, almost as important as the notion of legal abolition is, again, the other point, which is, but it's got to be on our terms. It's what you replace it with. It's what comes in its place. That's almost as important. And, you know, that obviously fits in with, say, for example, argument, say, Shanice was making at the end about not just abolishing the police, but giving services to other public bodies which are accountable, for example. And it's exactly the same over the specific thing you're doing, the commercialisation of the law.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who'd like to offer a comment or ask a question from the room? I'd like to ask one question. I was really interested in the Dave Smith drawing attention to limited liability only coming in 1865. So in a sense, isn't limited liability a business saying in advance that it's not going to honour its debts? And I've often wondered why that's something that socialist parties haven't made more of an issue about limited liability, and whether in fact that isn't one of the particular privileges of a capitalist system in the courts. There's a very famous trade union case of, which I'm sure you know, Taff Valley, where Taff Vale, I beg your pardon, where you will be able to say more about it. But the interesting thing there was that the legislature actually reversed what happened in the courts. The legislature was more progressive than the courts. But in a sense, it's the other side of that limited liability case, that the legislature enabled trade unions, protected trade unions, by setting up immunities from for paying damages. But what do you think about that limited liability?
I think the limited liability stuff is just, if Elon Musk makes an absolute fortune, he can like have as much money as he wants. But if the company he owns absolutely loses a fortune and owes loads of people loads and loads of money, they could owe people billions of pounds, you know, get the scale that he's working at, or any company anywhere can owe people lots and lots of money. They literally just close themselves and that's it. You can't get them out, even if the owner of it is a billionaire. The way the limited exactly as you said, it's effectively a piece of law that allows companies and rich people, because they're the people who effectively are using it, not to pay their debts. I've never heard it said like that, but it's exactly what it amounts to, of course. And I think the reason everyone's got so much difficulty with it is this idea that we are taught from a very young age in this country about the sanctity of private property, about we're taught about how great limited companies are. You know, companies are nowadays, companies like Apple and Tesla and stuff like that are seen as like almost like rock stars. You know, they're companies that are doing it, and it's. I think it's because it's just been fed through the media and the entire, not just in Britain, but global, legal system is geared around these people doing it like that. There's a term that they use which is called corporate capture. That when big governments are going to introduce new legislation, they bring in the big corporations that are relevant to it, and the corporations help write the legislation. In Grenfell Tower, the company that made the cladding on Grenfell Tower, Arconic, were actually brought in by the British government to help write up and produce the legislation and the regulations relating to cladding. And they literally boasted on their website, Arconic, that because they'd been engaged by the British government, they had made the regulations more palatable and more profitable for the company. They literally boasted on it. And then the same thing happened, is what we all saw what happened at Grenfell. And this isn't just happening, Grenfell is an example of something that's going on all around the world, and it's almost as if you dare challenge it, you are condemned by the press and you're, pilloried as some kind of lunatic, when in reality, what we're doing is, look, Plato was talking about what happens to people who expose the truth, thousands of years ago. Gramsci talked about, this stuff being fed into us and we all think it's natural. I think that's the problem. I think the problem is most people have bought into the fact that it's just normal, even though this has only been in existence for 160 years. Sorry if that was
I think it's very interesting. David's original, where he, in his first contribution, talking about E.P. Thompson and Whigs and Hunters, where he talks about the rule of law in terms of an inhibition or a check on power as being an unqualified human good. I'm wondering, clearly, and you've all given very powerful examples of where law can be oppressive, I'm wondering to what extent you feel that law may also be, thinking of some of the kind of early judicial review cases in the 1960s, which Stephen Sedley took, the extent to which law can also be a tool for revolution and social change as well as oppression. But I'm interested in what everyone has to think about that.
Well, can I avoid that, but can I actually answer your question before, if it's right, and then I'll leave that for the other two to give them a bit of time to think about an answer. Just about the notion of who doesn't have to pay the bill. Because to my mind, that's a really extraordinary and complex and interesting idea. Yeah, and 3 points in succession quickly. Firstly, Taff Vale. Yes, Taff Vale is a turning point in British history. And Taff Vale decision in 1900 was about a rail strike, and basically the House of Lords said, if you strike as a bunch of rail workers, think rail strikes, something which still happened quite important in Britain even today, said if you go on strike as rail workers, then every single penny the company loses, you as a trade union have to pay it back to them. So every single effective strike will be so costly and expensive to the union that effectively they can never go on strike. The response of the unions to that was effectively to set up the Labour Representation Committee, the precursor of today's Labour Party, and to create such an energy and funding for candidates against both the Tories and the Liberals that suddenly you get the transformation of British politics. So it's a huge moment. And obviously, we're in a country where right now on the Tories' legislative agenda for this year is bills outlawing specifically rail strikes. That has not gone away as an issue in British politics, even after 122 years. Point one. Point two. What's really at stake at the corporate form? And I think Dave got there, but I just want to flesh out, if I can, using my words. What's really at the heart of it is the idea that a rich person, can make as much money as they like, and that can go on for infinity. Elon Musk can have so much money that if every single one of his children was to paid for every day of their lives the minimum wage, sleeping lives as well as waking lives, then his children would still be getting, and his children's children would still be getting minimum wage if they take it out of his salary in 6 million years, which is rather longer than there have been human beings on the planet. We want to accumulate wealth to establish some future which none of us are going to have. Not just we aren't going to have, but so mucked up as well, none of us are going to have it. When you turn an individual into property, this abstract thing, you say as property, the individual can no longer be sued if they make a mistake. You're saying that if someone owns a business, a construction site, Mr. X makes a lot of money out of it, a worker comes on the plant and they die, no one can sue Mr. X. That is the essential idea of the corporate form. It extinguishes what ought to be the mutual responsibilities that come from owning wealth. Now, the last point I want to make is this is also relevant to policing. Because part of the reason why policing is so mucked up is that, in Britain and around the world, is that policemen just know that that's their job. Their job is to protect property, i.e. rich people. But what they're protecting is this weird and abstract and alienated thing which is property, because the moment you turn people's wealth into property, i.e. they have no responsibilities associated with it, the state turns around and says, we give them an additional set of advantages, we'll protect their property, even if it's under challenge, especially if it's under challenge. And the reason why I mention that is just, if you kind of think about the laws that are made that the police don't enforce, because there are actually a very, very large number of them. Have you ever seen, for example, since the new Labour government in about 1997 abolished fox hunting, have you ever seen any of the fox hunters do the perp walk, come before the police, oh, we've broken the fox hunting rules? But there are actually lots and lots and lots of laws in Britain which we don't enforce. We hardly at all enforce laws against dangerous driving. Why? Because literally it's as simple as the person who's driving a car owns the car, and that alone is enough to put them in the category of property. Or another example I often talk about is laws against unlawful eviction. I imagine a few people in this room are tenants, as opposed to mortgage or homeowners, yeah? One of the things you probably don't know is, as a tenant, if your landlord tries to evict you without a court order, they're not just committing a civil offence, they're committing a criminal offence. That criminal offence is called unlawful eviction. But if you phone up the policeman, a police station while you're being removed from home against the law, not against the civil law like the things Dave was talking about, the criminal law, and say, please stop the landlord from evicting me, police come down, it's your job, you've got to arrest this person and put them in jail, you could be waiting for 100 years before a police officer will come. And the reason why that law is never enforced, and I say this as someone who works with a lot of housing solicitors, and trust me, we've put on an awful lot of training for police officers that makes no difference whatsoever, is that police officers are just incapable of processing the idea that there are laws which mean that people who own property are in the wrong if they don't comply with their obligations. The laws obviously only exist to penalise the people who don't have property, and they just can't process it because it's so out of kilter with everything they do in their day-to-day lives. So this notion of how we turn certain kind of wealth and make it property and therefore release it from any obligations is weird and important. And actually, just to conclude in a sentence, lots of people have talked about this. There's a great Joel Buchan book, The Corporation. There was a great film with the same name, which I think even won an Oscar in about 2000. There's a really great book about international human rights law and corporations by Grisha Bars, who's going to be one of the speakers in this seminar series. So, there are some people who talk about it, but nothing like the extent it needs.
Thank you.
But you asked a question and I haven't answered it. I deliberately left it to the other two. In case anyone's saying to them.
Sinead, do you want to answer that one about can the law be revolutionary?
Just a quick point, which is that I think it's important to say that the law often reflects gains made by social movements and revolutionary moments, and the changes in law are often an endpoint to those movements as opposed to a spark of those movements themselves. So, I think of a movement that people often lean to in conversations like this, the civil rights movement. You have to remember what came before the civil rights movement was decades of breaking the law, taking direct action, civil disobedience, and sometimes, the law was broken against businesses and corporations, as well as kind of, struggles against kind of corrupt policing. And it was only at the end of that struggle that it was reflected in legislation. And it's important to note that actually the Black Power movement of the 70s came after the civil rights movement. And that came as a response to the fact that, in fact, the new civil rights were in and of themselves very limited in their ability to deliver social change. And, I think of the end of the abolition of slavery, for example, and the way in which the law was changed so that it couldn't be the case that if you're a Black person, you could simply just be someone else's property anymore. However, if you were a Black person and a criminal through a convict lease system, you could then be someone's property. And I think what that is an example of is the way in which struggles tend to win changes in legislation, but those changes in legislation tend to be quite limited. I think final example I'll give is the Race Relations Act of 1965. Again, that bit of legislation came as a direct result of struggle in working class, Black and brown communities. The first time it was used was against Michael X, who was a Black radical. The Race Relations Act was introduced as a response to prevent racism against Black and brown communities. And the first time it was used was against a Black person. So I think, that's quite notable. So it's important. The law is a struggle and a terrain for social movements to fight on. And that's no doubt, laws play and can play a significant role in protecting us in the here and now and giving us some kind of shield. However, they are never, I don't think, the end in themselves under the current system, because we always come back to that question of power and in whose interests is society structured.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to just to follow on from what Sinead said. I agree with her, and the big one where the law gets introduced after big social movements that we always talk about in the trade union movement is the Equal Pay Act. The law that actually says women should be paid the same money as men, because prior to that law coming in, it was perfectly legal for a man and a woman to do the same job and women be paid less money just because they're a woman. There's adverts in the in the London Transport Museum in Covent Garden, showing the rate of pay for a bus conductor and the rate of pay for a bus conductress. And it's literally the same job. It's a different rate of pay based on your sex. But the Equal Pay Act wasn't introduced because working people, because parliamentarians or lawyers fought a legal case, or they suddenly thought, oh, that's terribly immoral. That law was introduced because Fords in Dagenham went on strike for it. They went on strike to get equal pay for women, and then there was a strike wave across the country of other workplaces going on strike to get equal pay for women for doing the same job, and then they introduced a law which was the Equal Pay Act. So I'm not against that laws being introduced. It'd be ridiculous to suggest that we're against progressive laws, and Michael talked about judicial reviews and all the rest of it. I campaigned for there to be a public inquiry on undercover policing. People have seen the spy cops stuff in the news where the undercover police were spying on the Stephen Lawrence family, and female activists were sort of groomed basically by undercover police officers for 4 or 5 years at a time. I was spied on by the undercover police officers. I was spied on for being a trade unionist. I'm a core participant in the public inquiry into undercover policing that's going on at the moment. It's been going on for 7 years, and we're still on tranche 1 of it. Do I think we're going to get justice out of it? Under no circumstances whatsoever. It's going to be a massive cover-up. Why are we in it? Because every now and again we're shaking a tree and bits of evidence come out. And 10 years ago, if we talked about undercover police spying on trade unions or spying on the Stephen Lawrence family or spying on anti-rape, people looked at us as if we were weird, And now everyone thinks it's true, But the downside to it is we've exposed all their wrongdoing, and this government has literally introduced a law called the Covert Human Intelligence Source Bill, the Spy Cops Bill, that basically says all of those laws that they broke when they spied on us and spied on the women activists and broke the human rights of the women activists who they were living with, cohabiting with for 5 or 6 years at a time. The new law that this government has introduced says all of them complete immunity for any police officer that does it. We are, as Shanice said, we are heading towards authoritarianism times, and we need to decide how we're going to fight against it.
I want to say thank you for everyone for participating. Thank you for making the event possible, and for our technical staff who've been here to make it possible. Thank you very much. And also, just to give everyone, if anyone from the forum would like to say anything, please an opportunity to make a closing comment, and then an opportunity for all of you to make a closing comment. But thank you. Today I gave a lecture to first-year students on the rule of law across in the Brunei Gallery, and it's been a fascinating experience, almost like seeing the other side of the painting. So thank you for that opportunity, and you all have an opportunity to make a final closing comment.
I'm going to be cheeky, and I'm going to abuse mine by... Dave mentioned he's a core participant in the Spy Cops inquiry. He didn't mention how he got to be the core participant in the Spy Cops inquiry, which is I was representing him at the tribunal, and I asked a witness to confirm that it was likely that the source of the information on Dave's blacklisting file came from the police, which they did. So that's part of the reason why the Blacklist Support Group were able to establish that they'd been spied on that way, and it turned out that the person who said, yes, that was probably how it came about. We now have loads of documents confirming that's true. And a couple more layers to the story, if I can. I remember what it was like sitting there, going into court, and Dave's going, you've got to ask this bloody question. I don't know. It sounds weird. You're asking me to say there was a huge conspiracy theory. Going, yes, I am, you bastard. I'm instructing you to. And I remember feeling this immense, that's me, Lefty Dave, feeling this immense resistance about asking the question. It would, I'm going to ask this, I'm going to look ridiculous, and the judge is going, you can't ask that, and it was just for me a bit of a reminder that some of the things we talk about in theory, and we say this is true, we say this is true, we say this is what happened, sometimes you do actually put the punches, sometimes you do try and show something happened, and actually it comes about, you show it. But I must also say, again, on the themes of this, you know, because as a lawyer, you know, I'm 50, I'm old enough to start thinking I'm going to look back on my career in the law. It's been going on 15 years. It can't go on for more than another 15. You know, 5 or 6 biggest victories, that's going to be in there. But, you know, was it a win that we set up this bloody spy cops inquiry that's been going on 7 years with Misting, who'd always been this absolute patsy for the secret state, who, you know, I really doubt that when anyone comes back and writes the history of that particular establishment cover-up, you know, people do look back. We've heard some of these, you know, the great reports from the 1970s and 90s. People remember some of them. But no one is going to remember Mitting on Spy Cop. It is just going to be officer unknown, blank, 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 blank. You can't see, you can't see, you can't see. And that's what it's going to say, pages after pages of nothing. And it really is almost the poster for the law being used to draw energy out of social movements and offers nothing at the end. Sometimes we win things, but my God, Spy Cops at the end of it, if any of you are still alive when we get to the end of it, is not going to be one of them.
I'd just like to thank David and forgive me if I said that we lost every case and it made him sound like not a great lawyer. Well, we went into the case. I remember we had a meeting in a cafe opposite the TUC's headquarters when the case first came out. And he said, "You know we're not going to win this, don't you?" Said, "Yes, we know that, but think of all the politics and all the publicity we can get for it." So sometimes, you know, you have to take the law as a test case, not because you think you're going to win, but because of the fact of all the stuff that we've got out of it. And, every time we went to court, we ended up being on the 9 o'clock news. You know, we ended up being on Newsnight. We ended up being on the Today programme. We ended up being on Victoria Derbyshire. We ended up having big double-page spreads, in the big newspapers. And so, you don't always win, but that's why they call this a struggle. I'd like to thank it. I'd also like to, thank SOAS and thank you, Shanice, for pretty much being my my tag man to disagree with David and push him further to the left as this has been going on. And thanks for people to come here tonight and listen to us.
Shanice, can we give you the last word?
Just for people to get involved, don't be complacent. There's a lot happening in this world that is horrific, that is dangerous, that is violent on the daily. And so I think if you are not involved in some kind of struggle, now is definitely the time.
Thank you.